Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next webinar in our PACE series on Profitability Analytics. I'm excited to be here today, have a very interesting topic on AI-driven scenario planning to increase profits by millions. Sounds like something we all are very interested in. We have Dean Sorenson back. He's a management consultant with a unique mix of strategic, finance, and operational experience across dozens of manufacturing companies in many different industries. He's also the leader of PACE's Manufacturing FP&A and Profitably Managed Interest Group. He's definitely a thought leader in this area, and it's very excited to have him here today for this webinar. Just by way of background, for those of you who aren't familiar with PACE, we're the Profitability Analytics Center of Excellence. We're a group of volunteer professionals dedicated to helping organizations make better, more informed decisions through use of our profitability analytics framework, which uses causal business modeling to make those decisions. If you want to become a member of PACE, it's free. Just go to our website, profitability-analytics.org. We have a whole host of resources that are available to you. We have podcasts, articles, ebooks, and interest groups, such as the one that I just mentioned that Dean hosts. So again, I would encourage everyone who's interested in this topic, which should be everybody on this webinar today, to go to our website, profitability-analytics.org, and become a member today. Just some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, so please remain on mute with your video off. During this webinar, if you have questions, enter them in the chat feature, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. If you want a copy of the presentation, Dean will present his email address at the end of the webinar. So without any further ado, Dean, please take it away.
Thanks, Rafe. Pleasure to be back again. As Rafe mentioned, I'm heading up the special interest group for manufacturing, and that's the context for this presentation. So I'm not talking about specific technology, or I'm not talking about a specific approach, but really kind of giving you an understanding of some perspectives about some of the challenges and opportunities for improving scenario planning, especially with AI. So, to me, one of the basic problems I see that companies have with scenario planning is that it just gets harder as you get more complex. So, smaller companies probably using spreadsheets often does all they need, but you get to a certain point where it becomes problematic. And this is especially the case in manufacturing, where you just reach a certain level of complexity. And one of the issues is that the ability to improve scenario planning is really contingent upon your ability to bring together finance and operations. And I think that there's a number of interconnected issues that we're going to be talking about. It's not just scenario planning, it's how you manage profits, it's how you manage value and cash, and all these things are highly interconnected. And one of the things I think that when we talk about scenario planning or integrated planning is that there's really no universal definition of what it means. And in the end, to me, I just look at what would it look like if we were fully integrated? And I call it dynamic cost, profit, and value optimization. So this whole idea of kind of self-adjusting cost structures, which few companies really achieve. And one of the reasons why I think they don't achieve it is that, Rafe talked about causal modeling. And one of the things that we'll be getting into is that there's really, really very little difference between kind of supply chain planning, activity-based planning. These are all kind of forms of causal models. The commonality between they're all driven by activities, or we may not call them that, but that's really what they are. So one of the things as we go through this webinar, I'm going to make reference to this white paper that I've written, and it should be up on the site next week. But I'll just make a comment here that if you look at on the operational side and supply chain planning, as we're talking about profitability management and profitability analytics. In supply chain, they're talking about this term called outside-in planning. And it's precisely well, I'd say 90% of it is the same issue. If you look at some of the underlying things. So that's why when I talk about this issue, this topic, I'm talking about finance and operations simultaneously. So as I mentioned, this is just what the profitability analytics site looks like. I just put a picture up here for you, but some of the things that I'm showing you today should be up there next week. So, as I'm talking about, as I go through, I'll make reference to some of these other things like the white paper. I'll make reference to it. So let me just kind of go through what I thought we would talk about today. So the first thing, what I'd like to do is talk about what I call the unrealized value, or what have we learned so far. So this is kind of taking kind of some of the things that we've already talked about in prior webinars, both mine and others, like what have we actually learned? And then what I'd like to talk about is some of the confusion around supply scenario planning, and especially as it relates to supply chain. Then what I'd like to do is talk about a simple application of what I call what if analysis in a small company, and what kind of really good scenario planning or supply chain or integrated planning looks like, and then apply that to like a larger manufacturing environment. Then I'll bring in the sixth spot, I'll talk about artificial intelligence prescriptive analytics with very specific references to what tools are available there. Then I'm going to kind of bring it all back and talk about what does when you think about what I call a planning and performance management strategy, and how the manufacturing special interest group could help. And then I'm going to bring in a colleague of mine I've known for many years, and we're going to talk about some of these insights relative to some of his experiences, and then we'll open it up for questions. So with that, let me just talk about, some of this, the unrealized value, or some of what we know so far. So a couple of years ago, if you look at kind of Gartner's conferences, they did the CFO conference, and one of the things they talked about, and was one of the major things that underlay that entire conference was this whole idea of cross-functional trade-offs, and the fact that if you look at the research down there, most companies have difficulty with this. And some of the examples of these cross-functional trade-offs are, making decisions about new products, customers, and suppliers. These are the things that kind of classic examples of decisions that impact the entire company. And that, when you look at these decisions, a lot of companies are having difficulty with them. And if you look in the middle here, there's a bunch of research studies that talk about what results from that is what I call the cost of complexity. And it's basically the cumulative cost of wrong decisions in terms of their impact on free cash flow. And like I say, a lot of these research studies come up with the same sort of value of complexity. And of course, if you're like an activity-based costing person, like I've done piles of that kind of work, these wrong decisions about products, customers, and suppliers are exactly the same ones that we would find when we did activity-based costing. So what we'd end up finding is that, there were a lot of products and customers that weren't as profitable as we thought. And, we, as well, one of my other experiences, I used to work for a prescriptive analytics software company, and I'm going to come back to them a little later on. But the main thing I wanted to point out here is that this prescriptive analytics software, it was essentially activity-based planning on a forward-looking basis. And there were, if you can see the value that we got out of it, there were so many case studies where we saved the companies a lot of money. Now, by the way, this company is no longer in existence, so I'm not promoting this company at all, but just suffice it to say, some of the learnings you'll get out of what I got from my experience with that company will go a long way to helping you understand why I think these kind of capabilities are so valuable. So if you look at, experience with activity-based costing and the prescriptive analytics, one of the things that we've already learned is that this cost of complexity, the things we find happen because our planning models are wrong. We're still kind of struggling with functional silos. And, one of the things we often find is that nobody's really owning profits. They might own margins, but they don't own profits, primarily because we have difficulty planning them. So one of the things, when you do these projects, one of the things that you end up finding is that, you obviously have too many products, too many materials, you're over engineering your products. And one I'm really going to focus on, one of my examples is that we're over serving our customers. And one of the things that kind of goes along with that is that we're really not managing their expectations well. And these are things that we know are happening in a lot of companies. And one of the problems, because we can't do that, manage these things well, this is why companies end up having cost management problems. So if I'm showing you kind of 6 research studies that all showed the same thing, and these are very consistent with my experiences with activity-based costing, is that companies who do cost reductions, but the vast majority, I mean, a lot of these research studies, 90% of them fail to sustain cost reductions for more than 3 years. And you keep finding this over and over again. And so when I look at, what's the value of all this stuff? So because companies can't sustain cost reductions, what I typically find is that you have these cost reduction opportunities that are embedded in their cost structure. So if you look at increasing revenues, let's say from $1 billion to 10 billion, what the profit improvement opportunities are often somewhere between, in this case, range between 10 to 500 million, like in the case of a $10 billion company. And as well, one of the things I'm also going to be talking about when we talk about these, evolving kind of capabilities, is that there's an opportunity to self-fund the development of these capabilities through short-term savings. So that's by realizing this value, right, that I already know is already there. So one of the things I'm also going to be highlighting here is I think that there's kind of like an innovation gap between what technology can currently do and how our kind of the technologies that we think about traditionally, like the financial and operational ones, I think they're kind of lagging behind what's currently doable with some of these tools. And that's why if you look at this one screen, and by the way, this one screen is available in that white paper I mentioned to you, that profitability management or cost reduction, that sort of thing, it remains kind of at the top of the list of finance priorities. And that's sort of symptomatic of the fact that, these traditional tools that we're talking about aren't really fixing the problem. And this is, to me, like how I think a lot of companies kind of really feel like I've invested all this money in all these different tools, and I'm still having these problems. And that's kind of where we are with a lot of companies, more complex companies who are kind of struggling with scenario planning and cost management. So with that, let me turn the attention to what I call scenario planning and kind of like the confusion about it, especially as to what tools kind of do and what they really don't do. So I had the opportunity to watch a webinar yesterday about scenario planning, and I just found this one screen that they used. And, they were really talking about sales and operations planning, and, they were talking about some of the same things that we were talking about, especially as it related to like decision making, managing trade-offs, that type of thing. So one of the things is that if you look at kind of like scenario planning, so if we look at, say, the last 10 years, I mean, if you look at what I call kind of the short-term and tactical planning, like especially a lot of these S&OP or operational tools, there's been a lot of innovations in terms of improving how you balance all these trade-offs with the intention of improving kind of gross margins or gross profits. And the difference here is that when you're looking in the short term, you're not really looking at your entire cost structure. But if you look at long-term planning, um, these S&OP type tools, yeah, they probably do well in kind of a small company, but the minute you start getting into big companies, they're not doing so well. And the thing is, the finance tools aren't doing that much better. And much of this really is a function of that the planning models are really incomplete, inaccurate, like especially in S&OP tools, where a lot of these tools, for example, so when we look at kind of activity-based costing, one of the things that we learned when we did all that was these overhead allocation rates just don't work. Of course, when you look at some of these supply S&OP tools, what are they doing to model overhead costs? The overhead rates that we know are completely inaccurate. So the reality is that these tools, some of these supply chain planning tools are talking about doing scenario planning. They're not really doing long-term planning, or so in other words, they're really not supporting, more strategic decision making, and primarily because they're really not really integrated either with finance. And if you look at it, one of the problems is that if you look at the weaknesses in modeling cost structures over the past 30 years, we've done really very little innovations in terms of modeling overhead cost structures. I mean, it's especially with kind of the financial and operational tools. Like the operational tools really don't model the entire business, and the financial tools are modeled really kind of overly simplistic. So this is really kind of the situation. So if you look at, the integrated planning value, one of the things you typically find is that, like with S&OP tools, they're getting the basic short-term, getting value, the basic short-term stuff, but they're missing the longer term things that we talk about with regards to complexity costs. So that's really what they're missing. So this is kind of where I see a lot of these tools. So I hear all these things, people talking about artificial intelligence and, machine learning, blah, 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 blah. And what you find is they're trying to attach these models to these, these tools to underlying models that are completely inaccurate. So it's kind of the whole garbage in, garbage out thing. So that's where I find, if you look at a lot of things about analytics, that's one of the fundamental problems I find in them. So with that, let me turn our attention now to kind of some simple companies and what's possible out there in terms of scenario planning, really to provide a foundation for how we get into more complex subjects. So last year at the Profit Plus conference, I did a session with a colleague of mine, and we called it dynamic cost and profit optimization. And by the way, I use this term just to talk about like what's the outcome of a fully integrated and mature planning and performance management process. And one of the issues you'll find when we talk about this subject is that when you really think about, there is no universally accepted term to describe the integration between finance and operations. You could say that integrated planning is it, but that's such a, I'll call it like a bastardized term that it means so many different things to so many different people. So one of the challenges that we encounter is that how you describe what we're really talking about here. So anyway, I just use this to describe kind of like the outcome. And one of the things that I think is really important to talk about when you think about integrated plans is the ability to develop what I call an executable plan. And I'm going to describe this in a little bit more detail in the next section as well. But the main thing is to simultaneously develop all the things that you see on the screen here. So manufacturing resources, which include, the entire NRP explosion, doing inventory planning, and then non-manufacturing resources, which is basically activity planning, direct cash flow forecasting, being able to automatically calculate manufacturing variances, and then do activity-based profit planning, and then uh, do segment profitability variances. So basically taking activity-based planning and then deriving where the opportunities are for improvement. So I'm going to get into some of these as well. And by the way, I've also covered this off in the white paper. So one of the main things is that from what I presented last year in the Profit Plus conference, we actually had used an XP&A solution to do this. Now, granted, it was for a small company, but what we ended up showing is that you could actually, the technology existed to do this. And, you can go watch the video and how we did it. But, we used an example of, if you onboarded a new customer, how would a brand new customer and a brand new product, how would it affect cash flow, my customer activity-based customer profitability, my people resources, how would it affect variant, all those things. You can actually see it and watch it work. And one of the key insights from this, like for me, one of the things I believe, as somebody who's kind of worked both sides, like in my background, I mean, I kind of way back, I came from finance, a CPA, but I have really deep supply chain experience as well. So when I look at kind of like a financial rolling forecast, so to me, S&OP, to me, they're the same process. I mean, I see zero difference between the two. And that's kind of like what we got across in the demo. And that, what companies really are looking for is really integrated scenario planning. And one of the things that, when you look at the evolution of all this, I see it kind of, you'll see the convergence between FP and S&OP, and that's what these extended planning analysis solutions are really pushing as well. And that just from a practical perspective, just by having them in one application, you're going to have much lower process costs, much lower technology costs. You've got everything on one platform. Now, having said that, one of the things I also found was that, there's really an issue of scalability with some of these XP&A solutions. I think that there's a lot of good things that you can do with it in small companies and simple companies, but, the jury's still out whether you can actually scale these things. So, I picked this up off of LinkedIn. So there's a lot of people out there who are saying extended planning analysis is the next big and best thing. It's then, Gartner's saying the same thing. I'm not totally sold on this because, because what I'm going to show you a little bit later, I think if you look at where the innovations are coming in supply chain, in integrated planning or financial planning, I think it's coming, like in the manufacturing world anyway, I think it's coming from supply chain solution providers. And I'll get into why I think that. And, as we start talking about this stuff, I don't know if you've ever heard of a book called Crossing the Chasm, but it was talking about the law of diffusion and innovation and how new ideas spread through a population over time. So, you look at early adopters to laggards, that type of thing. So if we look at kind of the legacy solutions, if you look at those who kind of like the early adopters of FP&A and S&OP and big companies, one of the things that I think that they're finding is that the things I introduced earlier, they're having these problems. Problem is that they don't know where to go to find the problems. They're experiencing challenges, and I think a lot of them are probably going to be ones to want to look at the integrated and enterprise planning and performance management process. And by the way, again, we don't even have a name for this yet, but I'm telling you that the technology exists to do this stuff, and I'm going to get into it in the next section. But to me, this is kind of like the innovation that's really taking place and really what we're talking about here. And one of the challenges I think that a lot of companies face, though, if you look out there, 99% of the what's being written is all about what these legacy planning and performance management solutions like the FP&As and the S&OPs, And if you read what they're saying, you'd swear they'd solved world hunger by now. And I think that, while that might be true for smaller companies, I'm not so certain that's true for bigger companies. So what I see happening, so I talk about this kind of tactical versus strategic finance sort of person. And I think, if you look at, a good portion of finance people are sort of like the tactical ones. And I want to make a distinction. And by the way, this is the kind of the strategic finance. There's also the strategic operational. So strategic finance guy is one who's kind of operationally um, savvy and on the operations side. And it's the operations guy that's financially savvy. But just from a financial perspective, when I think about what's a really strategic finance type of guy, I tend to ask one question, which is here in the middle. Like I ask, if you think about, cash flow forecasting, do you see the need for kind of supply chain models or, kind of bills and materials and routings and doing cash flow forecasting? So the tactical finance guy is going to say, why would I want all that detail in my financial system? And the strategic guy is going to say, how would you do it otherwise? Because if you look at anybody that's, part of the PACE group, if you've done cash flow forecasting, supply chain finance, activity-based costing, S&OP, you're going to get a completely different perspective about kind of what's leading edge versus what's not leading edge. And I think that people on the right-hand side are kind of looking at the market now going, is this really the best that we could do? Because, as a finance guy, you're thinking about, uh, you know, I think we probably should have been a little further ahead than kind of like what some of these solution providers are providing, primarily because a lot of them are really kind of general purpose tools. So I'm going to use that as sort of an entry into kind of scenario planning for bigger manufacturers. So I talked about this idea of um, of executable plans, and I'm going to start with, the prescriptive analytics tools. So these prescriptive analytics tools, one of the biggest things about them is that, when I was working on them, is that they created a lot of value. But one of the things that we couldn't do was actually, how do you make them sticky and entrench them into how companies manage their business on an ongoing basis? And that's kind of one of the things that kind of undid Genova. But, that's kind of like what I'm going to be talking to you about is how do you take this and embed it into a process? And a big part of this is when you think about, I'll just talk about, one of the biggest insights that we got out of using these tools is that if you look at kind of some of the biggest companies out there, and if you look at some of the biggest sources of value that we got, and by the way, there's a couple in here, there are a couple case studies where we saved clients more than $1 billion. And one of the reasons why we ended up getting that was that if you look at FP&A tools are driving global planning, 9 times out of 10, they're sub-optimizing. These tools just weren't made to do global planning. And we proved it, in a number of cases. So kind of the main takeaway from that is that a lot of the plans that you're getting out of these tools they're just wrong. And in order to really have something that's what I'd say that's really kind of driving value, I think you need to have what I call these executable plans. You need to be able to simultaneously do this and actually develop them in less than a day. And again, in the white paper, I have this process. So at the top, you see kind of a process that includes both rolling forecasts and S&OP. And I explain what's going on in each of these things. But the main thing I wanted to point out here is that these sub-processes and the models are simultaneously quantifying all of these things. And again, I showed it in the demo last year with that small company, but there are tools out there that actually do all this. And basically what this is just a whole bunch of unit of measure conversions. And, I don't have the time to get into all the details, but suffice it to say, that's the innovation. So you're really taking down the process of how you actually take demand and stick it into an executable plan to less than a day. So, and one of the things I just wanted to highlight here was this whole idea of doing customer profitability variances, because I thought it was an important thing to kind of get across. But let's just say that you've got a company and you've got a forecasted profit for a kind of a business segment, and we'll take a if you kind of boil that down, let's say that we're one customer that comprised that company profit, had a budgeted profit of 2 million and a forecasted loss of 1 million. And one of the activities that comprised that difference was processing customer orders. And we'll just say there's a difference between regular and expedited orders. So the regular orders cost you $50 per order. The expedited orders cost you $5,000 an order. So you can see there's kind of some service level differences here. So one of the things that you typically find, when you're looking at cost reduction opportunities is the mix. So if you budgeted, regular versus expedited at 97.3 and forecast of 75.25, that's what's driving the difference in activity costs and the forecasted loss. And the thing is, whenever I've done activity-based costing and you kind of present something about, customers, or you've got customers that are losers, or, you're losing more money than you thought, inevitably you're going to find somebody said, I knew that. I just couldn't quantify it. And the reality is that you can actually forecast this. And this is one of the innovations that I'm talking about here. And you can do this by way of attributes and what I call and the type of models that you use. So with that, I just want to kind of describe some of the challenges of scenario planning, and how kind of like what I call mature planning solutions are addressing them. So what I just showed you was that, the ability to create executable plans and plan activity-based profits and costs, most legacy tools cannot do this versus the mature ones that can. And creating a base plan and what I call, a day versus kind of like 1 to 2 weeks. And when you think about scenario creation as well, like one of the things about scenario creation is that depending on the tool, if they're really made for creating scenarios, you should be able to do it in seconds. And in scenario execution, you should be able to do it within either seconds or minutes, not multiple hours. And much of this, and I'll tell you why this is in a second, but you should be able to run scenarios across single business units rather than just having to run it for the entire company and run multiple scenarios. And one of the reasons for this is that if you look at different tools, and this took me a while to kind of ask, what was driving all this. Much of this has to do with the design of the database. If you look at tools that are optimized for scenario planning, these guys probably spent, multiple thousands of hours designing their solutions to optimize the running of scenarios. Whereas a lot of tools out there, and especially for some of these new XP&A tools, the consultants are designing the database structures, and you're just getting very poor results. And when you're running scenarios, a good scenario planning tool is stirring changes versus if you look at, there's a lot of IBP tools out there, a lot of FP&A tools, they're making copies of the entire tool database. So in some companies where you hit the copy or create scenario button, you can be walking away for hours waiting for this thing to copy. And so this leads to some other things which I think are really important here, is that you really need to have embedded logic, which goes completely against, if you look at a lot of the FP&A tools, it's probably one of the main things I find, as well as, one of the things that's interesting, a differentiator of what I call these more modern and kind of supply chain tools. You have these things, and this is the one technical term I'm going to use, global unique identifiers, where if you change the name or number of a product, it doesn't really, within your ERP system, you have multiple ERP systems, they're really good at maintaining the integrity. And that's something that's not always so great in FP&A tools. And that they've got, if you look down as well, they've got integration mechanism to go end to end. So one of the major things I'm trying to get across here is that there's just distinct differences between a good tool that's made for scenario planning and one it's sort of an afterthought. And I think in a lot of cases, a lot of these tool providers are now finding that, these afterthought approaches just aren't working so well. And this is especially the case in kind of like financial models, where I think that, one of the main things I want to get across on this page is that, the whole idea of having modeling objects and having kind of the processes and activities as a central integrating structure is really important, and kind of like one of the main things, if you will, to really driving really robust scenario planning. And so this is a real problem in kind of financial models, especially some of the older models that have been around for a while. I've run across a couple of them. One of the biggest things I remember going through training courses when you listen to them, it kind of makes your head hurt to listen to them. And they're just these long courses. It takes you 6 weeks to learn how to do the basic stuff. And the reality is that if you got a good tool, you should be able to teach somebody how to do kind of basic modeling so that you can be good at building a business related model in less than a day. So this is kind of like some of the things I'm finding. So this one slide, again, this is described in the white paper, but one of the reasons I put this in here is that I talk about these kind of flow-based models. One of the major things here is that if you look at the planning terms on the right, this is basically all the same things. And one of the main things I want to get across about having this embedded logic is that what it does is it makes the models modular, and it actually simplifies them. So when you think about kind of if you kind of put aside the supply chain logic for a second, if you think about activity-based planning, you can essentially, think about activity-based planning and the models that you need. You really only need like three or four formulas, as opposed to if you look at kind of FP&A tools, you're going to have, hundreds of unique formulas. But if you have a modular tool that's doing basically the same thing over and over again, it makes life way much easier. And the thing is, one of the biggest things that I think that, finance people can take away from the supply chain world is this whole modular approach to modeling, separating dependent and independent demand. These are some real learnings, because I think that if you look at a lot of these financial modeling tools, just they really kind of have, I don't think they've really kind of leveraged what we already know to be really good modeling capabilities. And, so the proof is kind of in the pudding as well. Like one of the things is that, with these tools here, like this Genova tool, the lowest amount I think we ever saved a company was like $100 million. You won't find an FP&A tool that comes even remotely close to saving that kind of money. You just won't. So, that's the main difference. And just from a practical experience perspective, one of the things, if you look at, kind of integrating these processes, that you're basically going to eliminate a whole bunch of redundant processes and a whole bunch of non-value activities, not the least of which is doing all these variances that kind of supply chain functions end up doing mostly manual right now. So these tools are kind of automating all these things. So what I just covered off there was, and again, there was a lot of information there, but the technology is actually already there to do what I just described in that last section for large manufacturers. And I think what you'll find is supply chain planning tools are doing that. And I think as well, these tools are also providing the foundation for effective use of prescriptive analytics, which is really one, and artificial intelligence, which is one to cover off right now. So again, these terms are in the white paper as well, but I wanted to introduce to you this term called evolutionary computation, and the math behind this is kind of way beyond my understanding or my capabilities, but what it does is really pretty interesting. This definition, I took this from Wikipedia. You can see it's a field of artificial intelligence. But one of the main things that's different about it, if you think about kind of like when we think about optimization tools, we think of linear optimization, which means I have an objective function and I have, some constraints I need to manage. So if my objective function is that I want to optimize profits or I want to optimize cash, um, here's the optimal solution to do that, given the objectives, the constraints that you've told me. Now, that's all great when you've got like a short-term decision and you don't have a lot of variability. But when you're looking at long-term decisions, that doesn't always apply so well. So what evolutionary computation does, it looks kind of like at a surface of potential options. So if you want to look at, optimizing, cash, costs, and market share, you can look at these things horizontally, plus more holistically. Plus, as you're looking out, you're getting a range of potential options that you can play with, especially when you start looking at uncertainty in terms of potential probabilities in terms of how the market's going to play out. To me, if you look at AI, this is where the money's at in AI. I mean, to me, when you talk about scenario planning, decision making, there's a whole bunch of things I think that you can do with tools like this. But the foundation for utilizing these tools are the object-based models I just showed you. So you're not gonna get to this with a whole bunch of well, I'm not gonna say not, but it's going to make it way more difficult to get to this point if you've got a model that's what I call not ready for prescriptive analytics. And what I mean by prescriptive analytics, when you're modeling activities and resources, you can identify objectives and constraints, or constraints by each, and what the rules are for managing those constraints. And these sorts of scenarios, I think, and these types of tools, I think are what people were really looking for. If you look at, when COVID hit, people were talking about the importance of having tools to manage COVID. And like if you're thinking about regulatory changes, these are all kind of things which are multiple objectives, multiple constraints. And, I think it's a bit of, in a lot of cases, it's a bit of a myth that, when you talk about tools, traditional tools that can do this kind of stuff. And I put a couple of things in here, like this is from Gartner. I saw this like a day or two ago, with these tariffs happening in between US and Canada. There's so many uncertainties here that these sorts of tools would be especially relevant in terms of managing towards this. And here's another one I got from Gartner yesterday, and it talks about how CFOs and finance leaders can drive effective decision making. But one of the things they talked about was about, they talked about 80% of advanced analytics investments will fall short of their ROI targets. They said due to data governance strategies. I think the bigger issue, and the data governance is definitely an issue, but I think the bigger problem, if you look at, why companies aren't getting the value out of analytics, it's the issues I talked about earlier. You got a bad model, and it's not really operationally realistic, and modeling how resources are consumed and how modeling profitability. And in other words, it's not really addressing the trade-offs that we talked about earlier. That's what I think the problem is in analytics. So we talk about how can we apply this just from a strategy perspective and as a manufacturing special interest group. So first off, like one of the things, I think there's a lot of stuff being said out there. I mean, if you look at all these solutions out there, I mean, it makes your head hurt as to how many different terms are used out there. And I think that, for somebody out there buying software tools, I think it's really kind of hard to kind of tell one from the other. So what I want to do is, like, if somebody said to me, like, what's the difference between, really modern solutions and ones that aren't so modern, like, what would you say the real differentiators are? Like, so if I were going to go buy like an integrated solution or even just a financial solution, what questions would I be asking? So first one is like, what's it worth? Like if you ask like an FP&A tool vendor, what's your tool worth? They're going to be stumbling all over that question. Because the reality is like most of them haven't really thought through, how it's going to improve profitability. And then what's the short-term ROI? So to me, a lot of these, one of the things about, I think, modern tools with embedded logic in it is that you can build the models in a very short period of time, and they're basically building, it's not just a driver-based model, it's an activity-based profit model. And the insight you get out of that, you should be able to self-fund these things within 3 to 6 months. There's a lot of reduction in cost of actually lowering the cost of planning. And there's some key improvement areas that I talked about earlier. So, when you talk to kind of some of these FP&A vendors, to me, I just not hearing kind of like, what's it worth and tell me things are really going to do differently. And the reality is if you look, again, this graphic is in the white paper. If you ask these FP&A tool vendors, how are you going to help me address these challenges, especially like things like sustainable cost reduction, profitable growth? They don't really have really good answers for it. And, one of the things I think is that, like, especially if you look at like kind of FP&A tools, if you ask them, how are you eliminating functional silos and how are you driving cross-functional alignment? The reality is that they're not. I think they're doing more to reinforce silos than they are to eliminate them. So I think a lot of what's being said, I think, is being kind of overselling what these tools really do. And I don't think if you look at kind of like the traditional, um, technology analysts and how they're looking at the world, I don't think they're really doing us any favors in terms of looking at this. And this is kind of where I get into the manufacturing special interest group, because one of the challenges I think a lot of the I call kind of a change agent companies have is that they get constrained by their IT group, and that if you're not using kind of like whoever the technology analysts think are the leaders, that's going to be a problem for us, and that gets to be problematic. And to me, the ones that are kind of really driving the change are the ones that are kind of thinking, how are we going to manage complexity in a big company? Because the reality is that the tools that you require for a small company are completely different than ones you require for a big company. And, whether they say this or not, a lot of these tool vendors are implicitly assuming that the tools you need for a small company are the same ones you need for a big one, and that's just not the case. And I think that this is kind of like one of the things I see kind of like a special interest group helping to do, which is avoid making wrong decisions, because I think a lot of companies are still kind of out there making wrong decisions. And this is where I think I have this group out there. We thought we would use this to kind of help the manufacturing special interest group here at PACE. So what I'd like to do is invite you guys to get involved in it, because this is sort of a kickoff for the group, so we can discuss some of these things. So what I'd like to do is introduce a colleague of mine that I've known, and we may not get the same amount of time that I thought. I think I'm running a little long, but just I'd like to just kind of go over a couple of things with Richard. But Before doing so, I'd just like to mention that there's a woman by the name of Laura Ciceri. I talked about outside-in planning. She's kind of coining this term, and she writes a blog, and I think she's got like I don't know, 500,000 or more followers on LinkedIn. She's a real influencer, and she wrote an article about Eastman about some of the problems that they had with their um, integrated planning implementation. And you can read it on your own, but it's not the most complimentary of articles. But given that she already kind of opened the kimono, I thought we could actually kind of talk about it and say, look, here's a guy who was kind of in the middle of all this. And if you think about people who could really use a manufacturing special interest group, it's a guy like this who was kind of sort of in the middle of it. So Richard, I've got a bunch of questions on the screen here that we talked about, but I just thought perhaps you can kind of share some thoughts about, maybe your impression of what Laura wrote and some of the things I've talked about so far.
Sure, sure. For a little background, I was involved in this project. I was one of the senior leads on the project when we launched it, and I was with the project for about a year before I left and went into independent consulting. Your first question, my impression of this article. Well, Laura's a very highly respected analyst out there, right? And when she writes an article like this and about a project that I was heavily involved in, it's very, it's disappointing to see it. It was disheartening, right? This project was a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of money put into it. And when you read her article, the value you got out of that, disappointing, right? Not something that I'm looking back on and saying, hey, that was a really successful part of my career, to be honest with you. Okay.
What about
Go ahead.
So just curious, what do you think about, when I talked about those scenario planning issues, taking too long to get in what I call an executable plan? I mean, I think that you've told me that was an issue for you, right?
Huge issue. I mean, the IBP process, the standard process itself is really too long, right? I got a week for demand, and then I lock a demand, and I got a week for supply, I lock a supply. Time I get to my executive meeting, my executive's sitting on, why am I discussing a demand plan that's a month old? Why am I, it's these we're going to lock the demand plan at sometime in a month, right? That's a 4 to 5 week process in itself. Problem with scenarios comes up with, well, if I build a scenario, well, that scenario is going to take me even longer than that 5 weeks to build, right? And by the time that scenario is complete and somebody's given me the analysis from it, I'm like, well, this is outdated. All the inputs that went into that scenario, now they've all changed, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about the scenarios. How do I build we got one scenario option now. It's going to take me a month and a half to build an analysis around that scenario. Well, tomorrow night, Trump's going to come up with a different tweet that's going to completely change it. So,
Yeah.
I need something a heck of a lot quick. I need to be able to collapse my planning process down from this 4 to 5 weeks down to, no more than 2 weeks. 2 weeks is almost unreasonable anymore.
I do want to interrupt for
So-
1 second here. We have an end of webinar poll. We'll continue the presentation, but for those attending the webinar today, please be sure to take the poll before you leave. Thank you.
Okay. So just, because of the sake of time, Richard, knowing like we discussed, challenges with that project, many occasions, but one of the things that you and I have talked about is if you look at, kind of the information that's publicly available, basically I think you guys did what most people were saying were best practices, but, there were basically, what we thought were kind of lagging practices. One of the challenges that I think we talked about, or one of the reasons why I'm thinking about the manufacturing special interest group, is to find a place where people can talk about, integrated planning, scenario planning in a place where people have kind of been there, done that. And I'm wondering if you had like a special interest group that could have articulated some of these things back when you guys were getting started, do you think that would have been a helpful thing in terms of kind of getting the company pushed in a different direction and
Most definitely,
avoiding the
most definitely.
challenges?
Yeah, most definitely. I actually saw one of the questions from someone was, how do you get this thing launched, right? And I think that's probably where, if I could do it again, we relied too much on the big consultants, right? The big consultants, we thought, hey, these were the thought leaders. These are the people who would bring it in. Well, no, it's not the case. The tools that were out there limited us, right? The tools were, well, I have a demand planning solution separate than a supply planning solution. We cobble these tools together and we somehow call that integrated. Well, no, I'm passing plans, right? Somebody who understands that this all needs to be a single platform, the tool, single platform, something where I can have, I call it my holy grail of planning, is a demand planner, a supply manager, and a financial analyst looking at over each other's shoulder at the same screen. The demand manager making tweaks to, this is what we're going to choose to sell. The supply planner then making, well, okay, well, here I'm going to make tweaks to how we're going to supply to that. A financial analyst looking over that going, okay, here is the impact of these decisions on your cash flow statement, your free cash flow, right? So
Yeah.
the tools we looked at, well, no, they weren't, they didn't do the financial, right? They just focus on volume and maybe profit margin or
Yeah.
variable margin, right? That's the wrong
Right.
thing to be focusing on. The tools need to be able to real quickly expose these are the impacts on my free cash flow. Free cash flow is what I'm going to use to pay my bills, to reinvest in my business, and to make my shareholders happy. Every decision I make, and everybody in the process in that tool needs to be focused on, well, no, what do we do to get the best free cash flow,
Right.
right?
Well, I
Go
just, for
ahead.
the sake of time, go ahead. Did you
Oh,
have
I was just
one
going to
other
say
point?
that what I would do different is, groups like this that you're creating, I would get these groups in front of my senior leaders, and I would
Mhm.
look, had these discussions. What are you really trying to do with integrated business planning? What's the gap between what you want to do, what it should be doing, and your current the 5-step process, the technologies that you have in house, and start thinking outside the box with groups like yours about, well, no, the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing over and over again and hope for a different result. Well,
Yeah.
let's not keep doing the same thing over and over again.
Right. So just for the sake of time, I just want to kind of close things out. We didn't have time for all the questions, but just one of the main things that I wanted to get across here is the need for education and collaboration on this issue. So I covered a lot of stuff here, and I wasn't presenting like a particular solution, but as sort of somebody leading this manufacturing special interest group, and anybody who's actually looking at driving more integration and better scenario planning, just start to recognize what the issues are. So to me, this was just kind of a starting point. So, by next week, you'll start to see some of the things in the special interest group on PACE. So please feel free to go log in and join. And just that's basically one of the kind of the things I'd like to leave you with. My contact information is there. Do you want to copy the slides? Do you want to ask any questions? Sorry, we didn't get a chance for all of them on the session today, but I hope you found it useful, of interest, and I'd love to collaborate with you guys on through the special interest group.
Well, thank you. And again, we have run out of time. So thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Dean and Richard, for an amazing presentation. There's lots to think about here. And I would encourage everyone on this call to reach out to Dean if you would like more information about his presentation, these concepts, or about joining this PACE special interest group, which I think would be a great forum for exchanging ideas and learning more about this topic. So with that, thank you, everyone. You can learn more about our future webinars on the LinkedIn page, our LinkedIn page. And just as a reminder, our announcement, we will have our PACE Profits Plus 2025 virtual conference September 24th, 25th. It'll be a virtual conference, half-day sessions, and we'll be announcing more information shortly. So again, our website is profitability-analytics.org, and I encourage you all to go there to find out more about PACE. And with that, thank you, Dean. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.